In this video, I'm going to explore two of the main themes in Macbeth, those being ambition and guilt. And these two themes go so well together. When you write about one, you can write about the other, as hopefully you will learn as we go through this video. Before starting the discussion of the two themes, I'm going to just quickly run through some key context for the play. You have two areas of context here. We've got 11th century Scotland when the play is set, and in 11th century Scotland we have a fiercely patriarchal society with the expectation of masculine dominance and feminine subservience, the importance of lineage, producing a male heir. That's an important aspect of masculinity. And also those standard expectations of masculinity, such as courage, loyalty to king and country, and strength. And then the idea that there is no automatic accession to the throne. Often in this time period, the throne went to the most worthy warrior, and often the throne was won in violent circumstances, as we see in this play. When we get to Jacobean society, 1606, when the play is written and first received, many of the contextual points are the same. It is still a patriarchal society with the expectation of male dominance and feminine subservience. But other interesting points are the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, and the play therefore acts in some way at least as a warning against excessive ambition, which leads to treason. There's a strong belief in witchcraft and the existence and power of the supernatural, and that comes from the monarch at the time, James I, who wrote extensively on the subject of witchcraft and the supernatural. The importance of kingship is elevated and magnified even more so than in 11th century Scotland, because we have a country which has just lived through the reigns of Henry VIII, who struggled to produce a male heir, and Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. So issues about succession are really important here, and they were really important to James I. Most crucially, in terms of ambition and guilt, however, is the idea of the great chain of being. A strong belief at the time that there was a preordained order on earth, and this order was created by God, and it has God at the top of that order with his messengers, the angels underneath. And then we have kings and queens who are believed to be God's representative on earth, and then human beings, animals, plant life, etc. But as part of that great chain of being, of course, in a patriarchal society, the natural order is believed to be that men are more powerful than women. And that is an important point to note when we consider natural order in the context of the play, particularly thinking about ambition and guilt. We'll start with Macbeth and Banquo meeting the witches in Act 1, Scene 3. Banquo is an absolutely crucial character in this play, and the play's messages, key messages, particularly about ambition and guilt, would not work without him. Because Banquo, like Macbeth, is the recipient of prophecies. Of course, the witches predict that Banquo's children will be kings even though he will not, and they predict to Macbeth that he will ultimately be king. It is crucial to note that Banquo does have ambition, just like Macbeth. Here he says to the witches, if you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me. He asks them to predict his future too. He has ambition. And this is absolutely pivotal because Shakespeare wants us to know that ambition itself is not a negative quality. It is how that ambition is handled that is important. The individual that holds the ambition and how they treat that ambition is what he wants us to learn from this play. Ambition itself is not a negative quality. Of course, this contrasts greatly to Macbeth. So if we consider Banquo first, he says, if you can look into the seeds of time. I think this is a really interesting metaphor for Banquo's ambition, because what it shows us that his ambition is a natural ambition, something that grows naturally. It is to be nurtured, it is to be cared for, and with that nurturing and with that care will come inevitable growth. But it's about time. It's about letting things happen rather than making things happen. Also crucially, Banquo rejects the witch's evil. He says, who neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate. He doesn't want their help. He's interested in their predictions, but he doesn't want their help. Very much unlike Macbeth, who instructs them, stay you imperfect speakers, tell me more. And if we have a look at stay, tell, speak, and charge, Macbeth uses 4 imperative verbs here to address the witches when they disappear. This is a sign of the immediacy of his ambition. He wants it straight away, unlike Banquo, who is willing to let it happen naturally. He recognizes the witches as imperfect, so unlike Macbeth, who rejects the evil of the witches, unlike Banquo, who rejects the evil of the witches, Macbeth embraces it and welcomes it. This is developed in the same scene through one of Macbeth's first asides. Now, asides are when he is talking directly to the audience, not to the characters on stage. And so what we are seeing here is Macbeth's inner thoughts, his inner monologue. And he says, 2 truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. And the key word here, I think, is swelling, because swelling has connotations of trauma, of disease, and of illness. So Macbeth's ambition is something sinister and unnatural, unlike the metaphor of seeds that is used for Banquo's, where his ambition is entirely natural. Macbeth's ambition is associated with pain and suffering. Banquo's ambition is associated with nature and natural growth. Banquo also wants to moderate his ambition, unlike Macbeth, whose ambition is instant. He says he calls on the merciful powers, the angels and God, to restrain him in the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. He acknowledges that if we allow it to happen, ambition will naturally take over us. And he calls on God and God's messengers to give him the strength to resist that ambition, unlike Macbeth, as we will see now, who wants to hide from the judgment and power of God. He says, stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. The stars here are a symbol for heaven and a symbol for God. Macbeth wants to hide from the judgment of God, and what he wants to hide are his black and deep desires. And I think the key word here is deep, because what this reveals to us is that Macbeth's ambition is innate. It was always a part of him. It's crucial for you to note that the witches do not create Macbeth's ambition. They cannot be entirely blamed for the outcome of the play, because Macbeth's ambition was already there. Macbeth admits that to us here. And not only was it always there, it is his black and deep desires. This evil was pre-existing within him. It is not created by the witches. It is certainly not created by Lady Macbeth. They both might act as some form of catalyst for Macbeth's ambition and action, but they are certainly not the creators of it. Similarly, when he declares that he has vaulting ambition which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. That hunting reference confirms that Macbeth acknowledges that his ambition is a dangerous ambition. And he actually foreshadows his own demise here, because his vaulting ambition o'erleaps itself, jumps too far and falls down on the other side. So he recognizes how dangerous and destructive his ambition is, and yet he welcomes it and he proceeds with it and he acts upon it. And this is where guilt comes in, because guilt is an inevitable consequence of that excessive ambition that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth hold. This is Act 2, Scene 2, the immediate aftermath of Macbeth's murdering of Duncan. He says, "Our men stuck in my throat." He says, I was most in need of blessing, and our men stuck in my throat. The first thing to point out is that Macbeth's guilt is entirely self-centered and self-serving. I was most in need of blessing, he says. But the other thing here is that he recognizes that he is now distanced from the Christian God, because Macbeth knows that in killing King Duncan, he has disrupted the natural order and broken the great chain of being, and there has to be a consequence for that. And one of the major consequences in this play is guilt that cannot be avoided and cannot be overcome. He asks, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands?" He has a desire for cleansing. But quite crucially, we see Macbeth here appealing to an alternate god in Neptune. He knows that the Christian God has abandoned him because he has broken the natural order on earth. So he appeals to an alternative God to be cleansed from this guilt. But it's a rhetorical question. Macbeth knows the answer, and he knows the answer is no. He knows he can never be cleansed of this guilt because of the magnitude of the crime that he has committed, not just against Duncan, not just against Scotland, but also against God. Lady Macbeth's reaction, at least on the surface, is entirely different. She rejects guilt entirely. She calls Macbeth infirm of purpose. She's questioning his masculinity. She acknowledges that her hands are covered in blood and therefore guilt, but she would shame to wear a heart so white. She would be ashamed to be a coward like Macbeth. And in contrast to Macbeth's desire for great Neptune's oceans to wash the blood clean from his hands, Lady Macbeth is confident that a little water clears us of this deed. What's most interesting here, I think, is that Lady Macbeth is acting in a stereotypically masculine way. She is free from remorse. She is free from the emotion of guilt that Macbeth is feeling. And in acting in a masculine way, we see a reversal in gender roles here, which is another disruption to the natural order and to the great chain of being. Blood is an important symbol for guilt in the play. Then so is Banquo's ghost. And this is from Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene. After Macbeth has had Banquo killed, Banquo's ghost visits Macbeth during the banquet. And he uses this wonderful metaphor to describe Banquo's ghost. He calls it the horrible shadow. It's a beautiful metaphor to describe Macbeth's guilt and to describe Banquo's ghost, because, of course, a shadow can only exist in the presence of light. So what Macbeth acknowledges here is that the light still exists, and that light comes in the form of God, and it also comes in the form of Banquo's goodness. And they sit in complete opposition to Macbeth's darkness and Macbeth's evil. So in his guilt, Macbeth acknowledges his own immorality, but he also acknowledges that he is subject to the judgment of God and punishment from God. And of course, a shadow also follows us. So Macbeth also acknowledges that the guilt of killing King Duncan and now the guilt of killing Banquo will follow him forevermore. Guilt is an eternal consequence for disrupting the great chain of being and God's order on earth. If you're going to consider blood as a motif in the play, most students, when they write about this play in the summer exams, will write about blood as a symbol of guilt. If you want to elevate your response, I think it's important for you to track that motif across the play, so you can talk about how the motif or the symbol is changing. Here we can see in Act 2, Scene 2, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands? Macbeth has a desire to be cleansed of that blood and therefore to be cleansed of that guilt. By the time we get to Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene, he says, I am in blood stepped in so far that to return were as tedious as go over. What he's claiming here is he's so far immersed in guilt that it's just as easy for him to carry on than to try and make amends. There is no longer a desire to be cleansed of the guilt. Rather, Macbeth here seems to be embracing that guilt. I would even go as far to say that it feels to me like there's almost a relishing of that guilt here. There is almost an enjoyment of that guilt in this moment. But certainly it's a sinister turn of events, and Macbeth is letting us know that things are only going to get worse from here. It's also interesting for you, if you're going to talk about blood as a motif for guilt, to contrast the reference by Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 2, and the reference by Lady Macbeth in the sleepwalking scene in Act 5, Scene 1. The first thing to say is that Macbeth's is a rhetorical question. There is an element of doubt there. There is almost, even though it's rhetorical, there is almost a hope that he can be cleansed. In Lady Macbeth's all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand in Act 5, Scene 1, that is a declarative. It is a statement of fact. And it confirms that the guilt can never be cleansed from her hand. There is an acceptance of guilt there on Lady Macbeth's part that we don't necessarily see from Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 2. What's also telling is the gendered nature of their guilt. Macbeth appeals to a masculine god in Neptune, and Lady Macbeth in Act 5, Scene 1 talks about the perfumes of Arabia and her little hand, both very feminine images. So what we see here is guilt's ability to restore the natural order, and that is part of the punishment from God, that the natural order that Macbeth disrupted is restored through the inevitable consequence of guilt. That brings me on to hands and hearts as two other very interesting symbols for you to consider in the play. Look at how many references there are, particularly to hands, but also to hearts. Again, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands? My hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white. The very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand. Later then, what will these hands ne'er be clean? And all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. So many times. And it seems to me that hands in this play are a symbol of agency, of control, and it confirms that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are agents of their own guilt. They are responsible for their own actions. That is what the symbol of hands tell us. It is Macbeth and Lady Macbeth who are physically doing this. Nobody is making them do it. They have ultimate control over their actions, and therefore they have to take full responsibility for their guilt. The heart, I think, is a symbol of desire. And we see a conflict in this play between desire and action. But when we get to Act 3, Scene 4, and Macbeth says, "The very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand," we see a connection for the first time between desire and action. It's a very sinister turning point in the play, where Macbeth takes full ownership of his actions from this point on. And of course, after this scene, he orders the murder of Lady Macduff and Macduff's children. So if Macbeth is going to take responsibility for his action, he also has to take responsibility for his guilt and the consequence that comes with that. And finally, looking at Macduff's guilt is really interesting in comparison to Macbeth. Lots of students are going to look at blood. Some might look at the contrast between Banquo and Macbeth. Very few, I would suggest, are going to look at the contrast between Macbeth and Macduff. Another expression of Macbeth, from Macbeth, of his guilt. "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind." Once again, it's a self-indulgent, selfish guilt, but it's also a guilt that is full of poison and unnaturalness. Contrast that to Macduff. Macduff says, after his children have been killed and his wife's been killed, he says, "Sinful Macduff, they were all struck for thee." Macduff's guilt is an entirely sinful, is an entirely selfless guilt, unlike Macbeth's, which is an entirely selfish guilt. But more so in this moment comes one of my favourite lines in the whole play. Malcolm tells him to dispute it like a man. He wants him to challenge Macbeth and kill him. Macduff's response is magnificent, and it is as relevant today, I think, in terms of masculinity as it was in Shakespeare's day. He says, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man." And what he confirms to us there is, in his guilt, he becomes a much more complete and rounded version of masculinity than Macbeth can ever be. Macbeth's guilt is all about masculine strength, and he goes on this spree of killing afterwards. Macduff's guilt is about compassion and feeling, and it confirms that these are qualities that Macbeth lacks. So I think that's a really interesting comparison for you to consider. So in summary, ambition and guilt. Ambition is not a negative quality in itself. It is the individual who holds that ambition and how they manage that ambition that is the problem. So human beings become the problem, not ambition itself. Therefore, Macbeth is the problem. Lady Macbeth is the problem. Because Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, the symbol of hands, tells us they are agents of their own ambition. They are in control of their own actions. We know this also because ambition is a pre-existing quality in Macbeth. It was always there. And if you're going to write about guilt, think about what function guilt is serving in the play. Well, it is an inevitable consequence of disrupting the great chain of being. It is a warning from Shakespeare. It is a message to his king, who would have been victim of the gunpowder plot, that such negative and destructive ambition will come with punishment and consequence. Guilt also comes in gendered form. It is a means by which the natural order is restored. And then consider how guilt is symbolized in the play, certainly through blood, but also through hands and hearts.